We look southward again this week in fiction, and we're looking at Colson Whitehead's great recent novel, The Underground Railroad. So we're staying south geographically, and we're going to come up against some really interesting questions in terms of what fiction can do on the page. First of all, you kind of have to think here about how history gets told within narration. You know, when you read a piece of history, how do you read it differently perhaps than you read a piece of fiction? Or if something is marked as nonfiction, how do you read it differently than if it's marked fiction? And where do you find the line between those two things there? Are there boundaries that clearly demarcate one from the other? And Whitehead is also doing this in the novel. He's not only looking at the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction in some ways, but he's also thinking about the boundaries between North and South as he's thinking about the idea of an underground railroad. The really kind of fantastic thing about the novel is he reimagines the Underground Railroad, which was a series of way stations and really committed helpers to slaves who were trying to escape the South and plantation life. But he reimagines that railroad as a physical railroad, a real train that runs under the ground, beneath the soil of the United States. And so what happens when you kind of start to reimagine this almost like a science fiction world or a fantasy world of movement of slaves who are escaping? What happens when you start to imagine it that way? So it's a fictionalized history, but the history itself, does it have to move into fictional worlds to make the real history clearer when you try to understand the scope of violence that defines the country and has defined the country in its past? So when you think about the novel as history here, a couple of questions you might begin to think about as you read. What is a historical novel to begin with? And is it so easy to draw a line between what's fiction and what's nonfiction here? If you want to narrate, as one character says, the true face of America, do you have to kind of utilize fiction to tell that story, to kind of reveal that true face? Do you have to go into the lives of individuals and narrate, how those lives have developed in the course of the violences that have defined race in this country? Is that the only way to get at the real horror of those violences in some ways? And so you can compare maybe Whitehead's novel to a novel you might have read in high school, Toni Morrison's great novel Beloved, where Morrison tells the story of a woman who escapes plantation life, and then she has two boys, and when the slave catchers come into Ohio to capture her and take her back south, she decides that she would rather murder her two children than to allow them to go back into slavery. And you read the novel and you get to the end of it and you say, well, that was a novel, at least it wasn't that horrible. Real life wasn't that horrible. But then Morrison confronts you with an actual news story of a woman who did that. So you realize that the story that you've been reading is nonfiction, that Morrison has fictionalized it in some ways, but the real core story of the violence is there. So can you easily define a line between fiction and nonfiction in some ways? Also here, if you're going to tell the history of the United States, do you have to go underground in a way? Do you have to develop an underground history, a history that looks at the parts of the history that have been forgotten or the parts of the history that have been erased in some ways? And by using the novel as a means to investigate that history and by exploring the more fantastic aspects of American history, Whitehead is trying to get at that underground history, that those parts of the history that have been erased or have been forgotten in a lot of ways, or have been kind of in a way whitewashed. Also, you can kind of think about in these terms, how you read Whitehead's voice in the text here in the novel. It's a close third-person narration, which means that it's third person, but it's very close to Cora's story. So you won't get certain characters' stories. You only get Cora trying to guess at what other people are thinking about or what's happening. So you don't get a wide-ranging sense, but you get kind of her experience of this world and her flight through it. she takes the railroad north and south at times. How do you compare a voice like that to the voice that you get in an ordinary history book, a more detached or objective narration? Can you really pretend to have that kind of objectivity when you're telling history, or whether do you believe that history is always kind of a subjective discipline, that your point of view is the story that you tell is heavily dependent upon your point of view? So, in what ways does the novel give the writer a way of telling the history that may be, more accurate perhaps than, the kind of detached, pretended to be objective accounts of the history book that you might have read in your, grade school history class? The novel itself is told as Cora's story in this regard, right? It's a third-person account, but it's very close to Cora's story, with a few distinctions where other characters' worlds are explored, such as the slave catcher Ridgway. But Cora's story is at the center of this, and we get a sense of her lineage here. Jari, who is abducted and brought from Africa, is the last woman alive on her plantation from Africa when she dies in the cotton, as Whitehead writes. Her daughter is Mabel. Mabel grows up on the Randall plantation, but Mabel has Cora, but then escapes, and she leaves Cora there on the plantation. Mabel runs off, and no one ever knows what happens to Mabel on the Randall plantation. So that's a tension in Cora's life: is why was she left, and where has her mother gone? Is her mother still alive? Cora, when Mabel leaves, is left as Whitehead says, a stray. She's vulnerable to others, to others taking advantage of her, and so she kind of walks through the plantation with a kind of sense of what others look at her as having as obvious madness, that she will act in ways that make people think that she's gone crazy, perhaps. But they're more kind of coping strategies for how to live on the plantation. The plantation here, as it's depicted by Whitehead in terms of Cora's life on it, is interesting because you have kind of these basic rhythms of the slaves' lives there, their interactions and their trades and their economies, and their attempts to kind of forge a life in spite of their servitude. But the plantation also here for Whitehead is a factory, that it uses human capital, that it utilizes the ground, as a means of production, and so the plantation, there's no kind of pastoral version of the plantation here. It is about manufacturing and developing the crops. The whiteness of the cotton is its constant production. It's interesting in terms of like the rhythms of the slaves' lives here, right? That Whitehead doesn't want to give you a idealized sense of the slaves' lives, that there are rivalries among the slaves for the cabins, for plots of ground, that some of the slaves accommodate themselves to their masters. They inform on one another. They practice violence against each other. There's sexual violence in this novel. And Cora is trying to find a life within that plantation life. She's implicitly kind of willed a plot of ground when her mother leaves. It's a small kind of garden, and she fights for it. And that's one of the tensions of her life on the plantation. Is will she hang on to this plot of ground as the story unfolds? And finally, in Cora's story, as we get it in the first half of the novel, is the larger story is her escape. And one day Caesar comes to her and tells her, "I'm going back north, and I want to take you along because you're good luck." And so Cora will go with Caesar, and they will depart the plantation and attempt to escape it. What you have in the unfolding story here of Cora's life on the plantation and her escape is kind of also a telling of American geographies. It's a kind of America told through a series of geographical spaces, that make things more complex as opposed to the simple north and south that you get narrated in the history books about the American Civil War. Whitehead does this by developing a series of chapters that become like a series of different Souths. You get different southern states here. You get Georgia and South Carolina and in the beginnings of North Carolina in the first half of the novel. And through those Souths, he explores the aspects of African Americans' lives in servitude. So whether that's within the plantation system or whether that's in kind of the more institutionalized racism that's present in the South Carolina chapter, or the Jim Crow of North Carolina, the kind of codified life of African Americans that's defined by law and by violence perpetrated against them. So you get all these kind of historical refigurations of racism and how racial violence has been used to define American spaces in the South. Lumley, who is one of the workers on the Underground Railroad, will say that every state is different, and Whitehead explores that, right? The different ways and the different kind of historical purposes and moments of how race has worked itself out in the American South. One of the really interesting things in terms of the writing here is that Colson Whitehead is trying to find ways of narrating a sense of whiteness, and that old kind of figural distinction between what's white and what's black. The white being the symbol of purity and innocence, versus blackness, which is always about subterfuge or hidden desires. And Whitehead is trying to kind of like rethink, like other African American writers in our historical moment, are trying to think about how whiteness also has its own kind of negative aspects to it, perhaps figuratively. Cora goes into a wax museum in South Carolina, and she focuses her eyes on the wax faces of the white people in the exhibits. And looks at their kind of coldness and their manipulative qualities. And so you might note other places in the novel where Whitehead is trying to think about whiteness versus blackness figuratively. This is also a narrative of flight or displacement, again, as we've seen in some of the other works we've looked at. Lumley says to them, if you want to see what this nation's all about, you have to ride the rails. You'll find the true face of America. And so Whitehead is using the figure of the railroad to look at the country. He also kind of, can think about, how does African Americans' displacement work, whether it's through the slave ship or whether it was on the rails, like a lot of people, millions of African Americans left the South early in the 20th century and came north to places like Gary and to Indianapolis, from the American South to work in the developing industry around the American Great Lakes. So how does flight define this? And then you have these, you have the Underground Railroad itself as a figure here. How do you understand its place within American history? How is it a conspiracy of sympathizers? Does it offer a narration of hope to Cora here, or is it just more flight? How does the railroad also have a kind of terror filled with, a terrible aspect attached to it, as the steel runs south and north, presumably, throughout this American world. So what's narrated here? Is this the Underground Railroad? Is this a railroad underground for Whitehead? And how do the fantastic aspects of this story kind of work to change the way that you think about history here, or the histories that are present in American culture, particularly around race? In what ways is Whitehead's novel an underground history?